Hi Year 5, welcome to Tuesday's home learning of week 3. I was very impressed to see the learning that you did yesterday, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you create today. Today what we're going to be doing is looking at retrieval. Now on your home learning grid there should be some links, because what I want us to do is really truly understand what slavery is and why it was such a crime and how punishment was included there. So I would like you to be opening those links and starting to think about having a little look at them. So there should be an information sheet that is attached to your home learning, and your sheet should look like this. Now it's up to you. You can either read through it independently or listen to me reading through it. Think about where your challenge level should be. Are you able to read all of this independently and confidently on your own, or do you think you need somebody to help you out? What is slavery? The practice of people owning other people is called slavery. The owned people are called slaves. They have to work for the owners, doing whatever the owners asked them to do, and slaves suffered very much during this time. They had to work painfully long hours and were punished if they tried to escape or did not work hard enough. Top facts. Slavery had existed for many years before the Atlantic slave trade began. The first Europeans to enter into and profit from the slave trade in Africa were the Portuguese, who began trading in the 15th century. African kings sold enemies or criminals to European traders. Sometimes they had to sell slaves or risk being taken captive themselves. Approximately 12 million were enslaved as a result of the Atlantic slave trade. The journey between Africa and America, a journey called the Middle Passage, took an average of 7 weeks. Around 15% of slaves died on the boat to America. Slaves were tightly packed on board ships which could carry between 350 and 600 people with very little room. The unclean conditions led to the spread of disease, and many slaves attempted to starve themselves or became very depressed. Some tried to jump overboard. 70% of slaves worked to produce sugar, with others producing tobacco, coffee, or cotton. Denmark was the first country to ban the slave trade in 1792. Slaves were expected to work 48-hour shifts during the harvest time. Slaves lived to an average of 23 years old, and the Atlantic slave trade lasted 450 years. Why was the Atlantic slave trade sometimes called the triangular trade? The trade in slaves across the Atlantic Ocean was called the triangular trade because it has 3 stages. Items from Europe, such as blankets, beads, and guns, were taken into Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves. The transport of slaves from Africa to the Americas was known as the Middle Passage. Finally, raw materials and goods produced as a result of slave labor, such as cotton, sugar, rum, and tobacco from the Americas, was brought back to Europe. Do not worry if you need to scan through that again. I know that that is a lot of information to take in, especially on a new topic, so very well done for persevering. I've included some extra links in the home learning on the home learning grid so that you're able to hear from other people just what went on in this Atlantic slave trade. What I have just read to you, or the sheet itself, can you please answer these retrieval questions? Now, I would like you to have a think about the fact that you are reading a non-fiction text. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to have a think. What is going to help you with this non-fiction text, specifically non-fiction? What is there to help you find the answers here? And very well done if you said the use of subheadings. They are really, really helpful when retrieving information from a text, because they essentially tell you what that paragraph or couple of paragraphs are going to be about. So, for example, if you're looking for something to do with the triangular trade, then you would go to that very last subheading. You would go to where it talks about the triangular trade. You know that your answer is likely to be in there. So make sure that you're using your subheadings to help you. And remember what we said last week. Think about that word that you're skimming and scanning for. So, for example, here you might want to skim and scan for that word slavery or that word definition. That might help you. Think about the shape of the word that you're skimming and scanning for. Think about what first letter that is going to be. Remember, it depends on you as a learner, as we said a couple of weeks ago. So, question number 1. Write a definition of slavery. Now, that is 1 mark, which means that you should not need that much information. Question 2. Who were the first Europeans to enter the slave trade? And that is also 1 mark. How many people were enslaved during the Atlantic slave trade? That's 1 mark as well. Remember, think about those subheadings. Which subheading is that likely to be in? Is it likely to be about the definition of slavery? Is it likely to be in the facts? Or is it likely to be talking about the triangular trade? And then which word are you going to be skimming and scanning for? Question number 4. How long did the Middle Passage take? Question number 5. How many slaves did the ships carry? Question number 6. How long were the slaves expected to work during the harvest? Question number 7. When did the average slave die? Question number 8. How long did the Atlantic slave trade last? And question number 9. What is the triangular trade? What does that mean? Fantastic work, Year 5. Brilliant skimming and scanning for your answers and some brilliant retrieval, I am sure. So let's go through them together. You can either tick or dot the questions that you got right or wrong, and hopefully you've learnt a lot more about the Atlantic slave trade. So question number 1, write a definition of slavery. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly this definition, but it needs to be somewhere along these lines. So slavery is when one person is the property or is owned by another person. So when somebody from Africa was taken from their country and was sold to the Americans, that is a definition of slavery, specifically the Atlantic slave trade, Atlantic slavery. Question number 2. Who were the first Europeans to enter the slave trade? The Portuguese were the first Europeans to begin trading. It was not the people in England, it was the Portuguese, and that was in the 15th century, if you added that bit of information. Now, you'll notice with my answers that my answers are in full sentences. I would expect yours to be as well. Give yourself a double tick if you have managed to do this for each of your answers. Question number 3. How many people were enslaved during the Atlantic slave trade? Well, it was a major thing to have happened in history. Well, it was a major event to have happened in history. And unfortunately, there are 12 million, not just men, but there were women and children. They were captured and they were used as slaves. So they were taken from their country and they sailed that Middle Passage all the way across to America, and they were then sold into slavery. That was 12 million ended up in America. How long did that Middle Passage take? It said it took 7 weeks. Question number 5. How many slaves did the ships carry? Well, it depended on the ship. It depended how big they were, but they were crammed in like sardines, just as the story said that we read yesterday. They were really squashed in. The ships carried between 350 and 600 people. Question number 6. How long were slaves expected to work during harvest? Now, this question specifically links to when they were in America. Okay, so after that Middle Passage, when they were sold and they were expected to work on the plantations, which is another word for the farms, okay, harvesting all of the crops there. Now, during the harvest, slaves were made to work 48-hour shifts. This is when work was at its maximum and they needed as much from the ground as they could get. So all of the slaves were expected to work flat out until the work was done. Question number 7. When did the average slave die? So on average, slaves died at the age of 23. This does not sound very old at all, and it wasn't. Even though people didn't live as long in history, 23 is still not very old. Now, this is because they were made to work really hard and their bodies tired very quickly. The food that they were given to eat was not the best quality. They were punished quite severely if they did not work hard enough, or if something were to happen, or if they tried to escape, which led to infections, which also meant that the slaves' lives would decrease on average. Question number 8. How long did the Atlantic slave trade last? Unfortunately, it lasted quite a period of time. It lasted 4.5 centuries. Remember, a century is 100 years, so 4.5 centuries is 450 years. Number 9. What is the triangular trade? Now, this is quite a difficult concept to get your head around. So, the triangular trade was the trading between 3 areas, between America, Europe, and Africa. Now, each continent wanted a different thing, which enabled them to work in a triangular way. So, a ship at North America would take sugar, tobacco, cotton, all of these things to Europe. Once they'd landed in Europe, they would pick up all of these things here, which is what Africa wanted. So textiles, rum, and all of these manufactured goods, and they would take them all the way over to Africa. Now, Africa would almost work together with these countries, maybe slightly unwillingly, but they would work together with them. And because they got all of these things from Europe, they would take all of the slaves over to the Americas, okay, over to America. And that is how it worked in a triangular way like this. Each continent would profit from what the others had. Fantastic retrieval, year 5. Brilliant work today. I know that was quite a tricky text to be able to wrap our heads around, but hopefully now you're a lot more knowledgeable about slavery and why it was such a horrible part of our history. Can you please send through your answers to the year 5 email so we can see how well you've done? If you have got 8, 9, that is absolutely fantastic. If you've got maybe a little bit lower, have a think next time about what you could do to improve your score. Could you read through the text again? Could you be using your skimming and scanning techniques more than you have been? I look forward to seeing the learning that you have created. Brilliant job today. Keep up the fantastic work and have a wonderful rest of your day.